Welcome back to part 2 of this subject on component access controls, and thanks for hanging in there with the theory. What we'll be doing in this lesson is adding a component helper to compute the permissions for the component and adding configuration and access control support files. First, we need to go back to view.html.php in the hello view and revisit the add toolbar method. Remember we commented out a few lines in this method a while back? Well, it's time to uncomment them and put them to work. The first line is calling a helper method that we're going to create soon to put some data into a variable called $CanDo. This will be a simple J object, and for each of the access control permissions that the component is likely to check, it is tested whether the current user is allowed to perform those actions. The next block we uncomment is testing the core.admin permission to see if we should display the component options toolbar button to the user. The JToolbar helper class has a pre-configured method for this called preferences, and we simply need to pass the name of the component folder to this static method. We can save the view file and then move to controller.php. because we're going to override its display method to include the component helper. I have a snippet for this called basic controller display override, and in the snippet form I just need to add the lowercase name of the component. Once that's added, we can see that we're going to be using require once to load a particular file. For our convenience, Joomla defines a constant called jpath_component with the full path of the component folder as a shortcut. So we can very easily ask PHP to include a new file called /helpers/hello.php relative to the component folder. That's all we really need to add to the display method, and the next few lines of code simply allow the parent display method to take over. Now, we need to create the helper file, so I'm going to create a helpers folder to put it in, and then I'll create a file called hello.php in that folder. While I'm there, I'll copy an index.html file from another folder into the new one. Let's open up that new hello.php file. I'll set up the normal file header as we've done before, and then what I'll do is add a snippet called basic component helper. This has a number of fairly familiar values to fill out. When that's inserted, we can see that a hello helper class has been added, and this contains a public static getActions method that you'll remember we're calling from the view's add toolbar class. Let's work through what this method does. You can see that we're grabbing the user object in the normal way, and we're also preparing a results object that uses Joomla's base JObject class. The JObject class is a very useful base class because it includes a special get and set method that allows you to pass defaults in the event that a class property does not exist or has not been set. Next, we have an array of all the permissions that we want to check for the component. As I said in the last lesson, the only two mandatory permissions you must support are core.manage and core.admin. You'll only need to include the others if your component really needs them. Then we loop through each permission, call the user object's authorize method to see if they are allowed to perform the action, and then we return the result. At this point, we can go back to the browser because now we have something new to see. When we refresh, we can see that we have a new Options button in the toolbar. To make this button work, we need to add a couple of new files. The first is config.xml, which goes in the root of the component folder, and this is an XML file that defines sets of fields for data that we want to store against the component. It's read by Joomla's core config component to give you a simple interface for storing configuration data. I have a basic snippet for this file called basicconfig.xml, and I just need to fill in the name of the component folder. Let's have a good look at this file because the structure is important. The file begins with the normal XML prologue as the first line, and then on the second line I've included a comment with a subversion ID tag that is useful if you are storing your code in a repository. After that, we open the XML with a config tag. Within the config tag, we can define any number of field sets. which will display as tabs in the modal pop-up window. Each field set should be given a unique name attribute and a label attribute. The description attribute is optional. In this case, we can use a core language key for the label and description. Now, within each field set, you can define any number of fields by using our field tag. If you are familiar with Joomla 1.5, these are very similar to the old params tag that we used in that version. At this stage, we're only interested in access control setting, so we give this field tag a name and a type attribute of rules. There is a core language string that we can use for the label. I don't think class is used for this field, but let's make it input box and see what happens. We need a filter attribute set to rules, a component attribute set to com_hello, and a section attribute set to component. This field will then give us a similar looking tab to the permissions tab in the global configuration, and we'll see that in a few minutes. After the field tag, we just close the field set and config tags to give us a nice, well-formed XML file. Now, the rules field needs us to define which permissions that we need for the component, so we need a second XML file to define those. This one is named access.xml, and like config.xml, it goes in the root of the component folder. I have a snippet for this called basic access.xml, and I just need to fill in the name of the component folder. Let's have a look at the markup in this file. After the prologue, we open the XML with a tag named access, and we give that a component attribute being the folder name of the component. Next, we open up a section tag and give it a name attribute with a value of component. There can also be other section tags that relate to permissions for categories and also articles, but we'll look at those another time. Within the section tag, we add a number of action tags for each permission that relates to the component. The action tag has a name attribute, being the name of the permission, as well as a title and description. You can see that for all the core permissions there are stock language keys, and you can use those for the title and description. Once we have all the action tags we need, we close off the section and access tags. So, with all those files saved, we can return to the browser and have a look at where we're up to. When you click on the Options button in the toolbar, you get a modal pop-up for setting the configuration data. You can see that we have one tab, and that relates to our field set tag in the config.xml file. The rule field is displaying, allowing you to set permissions against all of the user groups that will apply for this component. We can see that the title of the pop-up needs translating, so we just select and copy that text, then move back to our en-gb.com_hello.ini file, paste in the key, and then give it a suitable value. If we return to the browser and close the pop-up, then open it again, we can see that the window title is now translated. That really concludes our journey to create a basic MVC component that also supports the new Joomla access controls in version 1.6. This is a good place to just break and consolidate what we've learned about controllers, models, views, and text translation. From this point on, we'll start looking at data and how to manipulate it in the Joomla administrator.